Bonjour. As some of you heard me say earlier, I will not insult you by attempting French because the only thing worse than my French is my German. So I won't even attempt that. Good morning. Almost good afternoon. My name is Mike Hillwig, and I'm going to be speaking about transaction log internals, specifically about virtual log files. Before I go into this, take a moment to thank the sponsors of this event. As a SQL Saturday organizer myself, I can't stress this enough. The sponsors are the lifeblood of a SQL Saturday event. Without sponsors, these events do not happen. SQL Saturday is free, at least from the perspective of the attendee. However, SQL Saturday does cost a lot to put on, and it's because of the generosity of the sponsors. So please take a moment today and go visit the sponsors, go see their demonstrations, and definitely take a look, because there are solutions out there that you may not know that you've needed. Additionally, and I can't say this enough, as a SQL Saturday sponsor, or as an organizer, SQL Saturdays are completely run by volunteers. And so please take a moment to thank our volunteers today, because this is something that makes it happen. Just a little bit about myself. This used to take 5 slides. I have it narrowed down to 1. I am a SQL Server MVP. Those are my kids, Reggie and Ruby. Actually, you can't see them very well in here. I do live in Boston these days. That's on the US East Coast, but I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the organizer of SQL Saturday Boston and SQL Saturday Boston Business Intelligence Edition. Online, you can find me on social media. My blog is at mikehillwig.com. I do blog about SQL Server, technology in general, technology leadership, and I am syndicated at SQLServerPD.com. And you can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/MikeHillwig. And actually, pretty much any social media site you can find me /MikeHillwig. I will be speaking at the PASS Summit in October. Who is planning on going to the PASS Summit? That's actually not a bad showing. I know it's quite a distance here in Europe, but if you ever have the opportunity, the PASS Summit is just an incredible experience. It's a game changer in your career. You will learn more about SQL Server than you could have possibly imagined. I actually will be speaking this year. My topic is Leadership Without Borders, working with global teams. As IT organizations become more global, and as we have people around the world, we have to work within different cultures. And that's actually what I will be speaking at in October. Not today. Today we're talking technology. Just a couple little things. Please don't let me speak too fast. If I am speaking too fast, let me know. I realize that I'm speaking in a non-native language here. I also live on the US East Coast. We talk fast. So if I'm speaking too fast, just wave me down and tell me that I'm speaking too fast. Boris, can I ask you to keep me in check? Thank you. All right, and I do have all of the scripts that I'm using today. There is a blog post. It's mikehillwig.com/go/VLF. Everything that I'm talking about today is already inside a blog post. And at the end of the presentation, there is a URL for your session evaluations. I would ask that you fill out your evaluations. For me as a speaker, this is very important, because it helps me understand how I'm speaking and what I can do better. And especially here, because I don't get to speak to a non-native language very often. So if there's something I can do to help you learn better, please let me know, because that will help me in the future. Now, this is a slide I put in every deck. And I think it really tells a story. In the back, can you see the background? It's a little light. But this is a man jumping off a cliff. And this is you. This is every time you read a blog post about technology, you are jumping off a cliff. I tell people, beware of the blogs. The SQL Server community is really incredible about sharing what we know. There is so much advice out there. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad advice out there too. And when I mean bad, I don't just mean bad as in you should run with scissors bad. I'm saying it's bad as in it's outdated advice. There are some really good best practices out there for SQL 7 that people still follow and probably should not be. We're now at SQL 2016, SQL 2014, even SQL 2012. Those practices for SQL 7 may not make sense anymore. So just be very careful when you find a blog post that tells you how to do something. I love when when a developer comes to me and says, oh, here is a best practice advice from Microsoft that we need to be following. And it came from the SharePoint team. You all laugh, but it's true. Every one of us have seen some piece of advice that has come back to us that we say, oh, no, I'm not doing that. So just be careful. So my advice is always trust people you know. Trust people who have established themselves at speaking or have established their credentials in SQL Server. But more importantly, I want you to assume that I'm an idiot. I want you to assume that I don't know what I'm talking about until we prove this. And that's what I like about this demo, is that we can actually show what's happening. Now, this is something that this is one of those rules I try to live by. I don't trust people who say you should always do something or you should never do something. Because with one exception, the answer is always, it depends. Does anyone know, in terms of SQL Server, what that one thing you should never do is? Auto shrink. You should never enable auto shrink. Anything else, the answer is always going to be, it depends. But more importantly, test everything in your own test environment first. This is crucial because what we're going to do today, we're going to be playing around with your transaction log files. Test this stuff first, please. So by the end of the presentation, you're going to understand what a virtual log file is. Today, does anyone know what a VLF is? Not bad. And then you're going to understand to determine how many you currently have in a database. Then you're going to see how and when they get created, as well as how to understand how to reduce the number you have if you need to. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And you're going to understand how you can get into trouble with having too many VLFs by using bad defaults. And you're going to have a better understanding of how to size your transaction log file properly. And actually, I shouldn't even say how to size it, it's how to grow it. The problem with virtual log files is very rarely the size. More often than not, it's actually how we grow our files. Now, I want to make sure you understand something. This changes in SQL 2014. Who is using SQL 2014 in production today? Okay, that number is about right. I've been doing this presentation since SQL 2012 was new. I'm going to keep doing this with SQL 2012. I will talk about the differences in SQL 2014. However, what I'm going to show you today is valid for SQL 2005, 2008, 2008 R2, as well as SQL 2012. Actually, it's probably the same as SQL 2000. Is anyone still using SQL 2000? Yeah, you don't count though. Yeah, I know you have clients who do all kinds of things. I first started working with this in SQL 2005. And the logic has not changed until SQL 2014. And it's the same in 2014 and 2016 definitely changed. But since most people aren't using SQL 2014 or 2016 yet, I want to keep talking about how an older method. Has anyone played with SQL 2016 yet? The community technology previews? That's actually not a bad number. I'm a big fan of grabbing some old hardware, some virtual hardware, and playing with new versions of SQL Server. There's a lot of neat stuff out there. So, okay, what is a VLF? Can anyone tell me? Okay. I actually got asked this in a job interview. And my answer was a very large file system, and I was wrong. The funny thing is, she hired me anyway. I'm still not sure, but I've had that job 4 years. I must be doing something right. It's a virtual log file, and it's nothing more than a chunk. It is a piece of your transaction log file. Every time you grow your transaction log file, it adds more VLFs. It's basically a piece or a chunk, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I also want to mention that I am not the foremost expert on this. I know this stuff, I play with it a lot, but Kimberly Tripp from SQL Skills has written several great blog posts about this. I link to them in my blog post. I actually had a conversation with Kimberly one night about this, and she was talking stuff that made my head spin. I know this stuff, but there are people who know this better than I do. And anyway, I link her articles on my blog post. Again, mikehillwig.com/go/VLF. So, virtual log files. Why do we care? The simple fact is, too many VLFs inside your transaction log file can cause performance problems with DML. It can also cause performance with transaction log backups. Worse yet, it causes problems with restores. If you're using log shipping, who's using log shipping? I use log shipping a lot. If you have too many VLFs inside your transaction log file, it will cause your restores to slow down. And having slow restores is probably one of the worst things possible. Now, you probably have too many in your transaction log file, but there are some fringe cases where you could have too few as well. So, as I've mentioned, we create VLFs every time you either create a database or when your transaction log file grows. I'm going to show you that here shortly. I have a demo that does this. And the number that get created depends on how much you grow. Now, again, up until SQL 2014, this is how it worked. Anytime you had up to a half of a megabyte, you would add one VLF per growth. If you added half of a megabyte to 3/4 of a megabyte, you would add 2. Then up to 1 megabyte would add 3. From 1 to 64 megabytes, you would add 4. From 64 megabytes to 1 gigabyte, it added 8. Anything over a 1 gigabyte growth added 16. Does that make sense? I have a script that proves this. I can do that if we need to prove it out. First question.
Just to understand, is that per growth or what?
Yes. Every time your transaction log file grows, what it does is SQL Server will look at your database settings to say, how much do I need to grow? So if you have your database set to grow in or if you have your transaction log file set to grow in 1 gigabyte increments, every time it will add 16 VLFs. And I have a demo that shows that. Okay? Is everyone with me so far? Have I lost anyone yet? There's always someone. I always lose someone. Oh, okay. Now, like I said, this changes in SQL 2014, and it's a lot simpler. If your growth is less than 1/8 the size of your transaction log file, it only adds 1. This is so much better. Any other time, the old rules apply. So it's just that simple. So if you were growing in small increments, it will only add 1. Now, does anyone know when this would happen? Why are we adding small chunks or small growths? It comes back to those default settings inside a database. If you look at your the default settings in a new database, it will say, I want to grow by 10% every time I need to grow. That is such a bad setting. I typically change that. I want to say I always change it, but that would make me that would go back against my other slide that said don't trust people who say always. So I tend to I tend to frequently change that setting and I like to grow in a distinct amount and not in a percentage. Now, you've probably seen the transaction log circle. What happens is we work with one VLF, and when it gets full, we move on to the second one. And when it's full, we move on to the third one. And then we move on to the fourth one. And what happens is when we do a transaction log backup, it says, oh, this one is in use and it has data in it. I'm going to back up that data and then I'll mark it for reuse. However, I'm still down here writing and I will come back around. But if I haven't done a transaction log backup yet, and this thing is still have data in it that has not been backed up, what do?
Create a new one?
We create a new one and we expand the circle. So we would then go to 10. Does everyone understand this? Do I need to explain that again? Okay.
Basically, in other words, if I have a transaction that is very, very big, and I might end up with, let's say, 1,000, and then I commit that, and then those 1,000 are still there, and that would just make sure my circle is bigger.
The commit, it could be based on the commit. However, once that transaction is committed, it still has to be backed up. And I'm talking if you're in full recovery mode.
Yeah.
Now, these rules do apply to simple recovery mode, but it tends to happen more in full recovery mode. So if I've written very large transaction, and I've gotten to here, and I commit it, but this one hasn't been backed up yet, I'm going to have to expand my circle. Is everyone with me? Feedback. We're good? Oh, okay.
But having a bigger circle, is that a bad thing?
Not necessarily. No. Yeah. Here we go. Having a bigger transaction log file, a transaction log file will grow to be as big as it needs to be. Now, if it seems to be, what we want to avoid is getting into that pattern of growing it and then shrinking it. Growing it and shrinking it. If you have a process that regularly grows your transaction log file, leave it big. Having the bigger circle is not necessarily a bad thing. So you want to look at the process, look at what is happening in your system to decide, do I need a big transaction log file or not? Did I answer your question? Oh, okay. So there is a problem with virtual log files. And the question is, how does it happen? And like I said, the most frequent cause is transactions log files that grow in small increments. And those small increments tend to start with when we're doing those percentage-based growths, and we start with a small transaction log file. If you have a database that is growing in that 10% increment, and that database has been around for a long time, and it has grown and grown and grown, and you have a transaction log file that is several hundred gigabytes, you're going to see that you have a mess and you didn't even know about it. You have a hidden performance problem that you didn't know about. That's what drives me crazy. So this what it comes back to is, are you starting with a 1 megabyte transaction log file and growing in 10% increments? If you are, you should probably look at changing your practices. And if you are doing this and your database transaction log file has grown a lot, you probably have a high number of VLFs. Have I lost anyone yet? You're still with me? Okay. So I played with this one and started trying to do this visually to show what it looks like. This is what happens when you start with a 1 megabyte transaction log file and keep growing it. You see how we're still growing in those little chunks? Because it's only 0.1 megabyte. And it isn't until down here where it really starts to grow more. This is truly based on that 10% curve. So I think visually it makes a little more sense. So speaking of transaction log files, you should probably only have one transaction log file per database. Does anyone have more than that in a system? Do you really? Let me ask this, does it span multiple drives?
Not for spell, just because there are a lot of process for replication, log shipping, and so on. So there are a lot of potential on one file.
And data files or transaction log files?
Transaction log file.
Okay, you're probably not buying yourself anything. Because transaction log files are serial, so it's probably not helping you. And here's my best reason for why you should only have one transaction log file per database. Because Paul Randall says so. and it's one of those things where smarter people than me have really proven this out. I'm going to take their advice on this one because Paul knows way more about this than I ever will. All right, so who's ready to see a demo? Now, I will tell you that I'm a fairly experienced speaker, but if something is going to go wrong in today's presentation, it will happen in a demo. It always does. Demos scare the crap out of me every time. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a real simple database. And I'm going to create my database. Well, first, if it exists, I'm going to drop it. In the back, can you see this demo? Yep. Oh, okay. And then I'm going to create my database. Ha. And then I'm going to back up my database. As soon as I create it, I back it up. Can anyone tell me why? What happens is that once you create your database, it is in a pseudo simple recovery mode. Once you do that initial backup, it will put your database into full recovery mode. It initializes the LSN chain in your transaction log file. This is very important. If you've created a database and then tried to do a transaction log backup, it tells you that it can't do it because there's no corresponding initial full backup. That's effectively what we're doing. Once I've created my database, then I'm going to add a table. Now, this is an exercise in what not to do. This is a really bad design. What I'm doing is I have 9 or 10 unique identifier columns with a default of a GUID. That means I am stuffing my database full of crap. There's absolutely no need for any of this data. But the reason I'm doing it is to make sure that I have a transaction log file that has lots of stuff in it. I want to grow my transaction log as quickly as possible. So again, don't do this at home. I'm glad someone laughed. I was so afraid that would get lost in translation. And then, just to make bad worse, because this is the stuff developers love to do, and we're thinking, no, you never want to do this. Watch, I'm creating an index on each of those GUIDs. Again, I'm creating a lot more stuff that my database doesn't need. And the whole point to that is, I just want to make my transaction log file grow as quickly as possible, and this is one way to do it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a transaction. I'm going to start a loop. And I'm going to add about 5.5 million rows into my database as quickly as possible. So again, all I'm doing is inserting a new row, and I'm only inserting one value because I have default values on everything else. Does that make sense to everyone so far? This is just my whole purpose of this is just to get that data in there as quickly as possible. So let me execute this. And I want to show you, and this will start to run. All right, you can already see that I'm already starting to put data into my database. What I want to show you next is what happens inside the database. Now, the first thing this statement does is I'm showing how big is my transaction log file. It started at 1 megabyte. It's now already 82 megabytes. It's growing rather quickly. And I've got to say, doing this in an Azure VM makes this go even faster, which is great. I love this. And then all I'm going to do is a dbcc log info with table results. And what you're going to see, let me get the right database. If you do a dbcc log info with table results, it will show you all of the VLFs inside your transaction log file. Has anyone seen this before? Yeah, you guys are MCMs. That doesn't count. So let me show you just a little bit. What you're going to see here, this is a file size column. You can see it's already starting to grow. This is in bytes. So this is a 1/4 of a megabyte growth. This is how big that VLF is. And then the other thing is a status. A status of 2 tells you that this VLF is in use, it has data in it, and it has not been backed up. But probably the most important thing to see here is the create LSN. Where in the LSN sequence was this growth? Where did it happen? And you'll see that there's 1, 1, 1, 1. And as we scroll down a little more, we'll start to see that we have cases where I created 3. And it goes back to that chart I was showing of how big is my growth to how many VLFs get created. Is that starting to make sense? Okay, what I did then was I had another script. I just did a simple analysis. I have a temp table that has all of those columns in it. And what I did was I inserted into my temp table by executing dbcc log info with table results. All I'm doing is taking this and dumping it into a temp table so that it's a little easier to manipulate. Then what I do is I started with the create LSN, the size of that of each VLF, and the number of them. Now I'm filtering out where the create LSN is 0. Can anyone tell me why? LSN of 0 is when the database was first initialized. There's not much I can do about that, so I'm just going to filter that out. And then I'm just going to sort it so it makes a little more sense. And what you'll see is each of these LSNs, I started with, this number is in megabytes. So I started with a 1/4 of a megabyte and only added 1 VLF. And then I got down to the point where I added 0.3125, and it's only 1. And again, this is starting with so what I want is, it starts with the default settings of 1 megabyte growing in 10% increments. So this number is gonna keep growing, and then what you'll see is once we hit the 1 megabyte mark, we started growing in 4. Is this making sense? Have I lost anyone yet? Okay. So what you'll see is that once I hit that 64 megabyte mark, where'd it go? Once I hit the 64 megabyte mark, I then started growing from 4 to 8. Is it starting to come together? Okay. Let me show you if I have this right. So my transaction log file has now hit the 1 gigabyte mark. So what you'll see is that my last growth was 144 megabytes, and I added 8 VLFs. I can leave this run until my next growth is 1 gigabyte. It's going to take a little bit of time, but it will grow in an increment of 16 VLFs. Can I ask you to trust me that I say that it's actually what will happen? We can let it run. I just don't have a whole lot of time. Okay. Okay. You shouldn't, but thank you. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to stop my stop my script. And I'm just going to commit that transaction in case something was open. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my database settings. So I'm now, instead of growing in a 10% increment, I'm now going to grow it in a 1 megabyte increment. So now when my database gets created, my transaction log file now grows in 1 megabyte increments. And I want you to see what happens. Ooh. This can't be good.
Did you run the entire query or just the line?
Aha. That's. Okay, one of my other windows is using it. There we go.
Set it to single user with rollback immediate, and then you can do that.
But then I'd have to change my demo.
Okay.
There's an old saying that you should never type in a demo, and I do it every time. And every time I do, it comes back to haunt me. Okay, so my database has been dropped. All right, now. All right, here we go. So the first thing I do, I back up my database, and now I'm starting to insert rows again. Now I'm going back to my original script. And you can see first that my transaction log file has already grown to 33 megabytes. That means I've grown 32 times. So what you'll see here is that I have 137 rows minus 1, 136 times. Okay. But what you'll see is that I am now growing in 1 megabyte increments. Ah, wrong script. So now I'm growing in a static amount of 1 megabyte at a time, and you'll see that every time I'm growing in 4 VLF increments. I could do this all day long, and this number simply will not change, ever, because I'm only growing in 1 megabyte increments. And that means I will add 4 VLFs every time. Make sense? And I could let this run and run and run. I won't waste your time.
But how do we know it's a good thing?
It's
No, not about the growth in the same size, but that it's always with 4.
at this point, just hang on, because I'm simply showing how it works. I don't want to talk about good or bad just yet. But this is bad. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back and stop this again. Let me commit my transaction. Now this time, I'm not going to grow in 1 megabyte increments. I'm going to grow in 1 gigabyte increments. All right, so now I'm growing and growing. While this is running, I'm going to switch back to my PowerPoint. So how do I know if I have a problem with VLFs? This is what I call a head desk problem. My head on the desk all the time, because it's an intermittent problem. You'll have this random performance problem, and on Tuesday it might be at 2 p.m., and on Wednesday it might be at 4 a.m., and on Thursday it'll happen at noon. You never know when it's going to happen. And it's probably when you're getting into certain points in your transaction log file where you have a lot of small VLFs that are currently being used. And you're also going to see an issue during log file restores. So again, if you're doing if you're doing log shipping, this is when you'll see it. And I'm working with some people who are smarter than I am, and we still can't find it. There have to be some different weights that show us where this is a problem. I've yet to find them, but I need to talk to some people who are smarter than I am. But again, by doing a DBCC log info with table results, I can see what VLF is currently in use, and I can also see how big it is. So if you're in the middle of this problem that you can't explain, look at what transaction, or look at what VLF is currently in use. If it is currently one that is very small, you might have an issue. And it's something that I've learned it's easier to just preemptively fix. So what I do is I shrink, well, I'll show you how to fix it in a minute. And this is what I call the Goldilocks problem. So in other words, this database has too many, and this one has too few, and this one is just right. The thing is, there is a just right for your environment. You need to figure out what it is. So how do we know what's right? You just have to baseline and test. But some guiding rules that I have is that if you have thousands and thousands of VLFs in your transaction log file and they're all really small, that may be too many. But know that if you only have a few VLFs in your transaction log file and they're all really big, that could be just as bad. And the number of VLFs you have will vary based on the size of your transaction log file. If someone says, oh no, I have 1,000 VLFs, but your transaction log file is 1 terabyte, that might be okay. But if you have thousands of VLFs and your transaction log file is only 400 megabytes, that's probably a problem. So does it matter how big your VLFs is? Yes, but size isn't the only factor. I'm glad I'm seeing some smiles. What you also want to look at is your throughput. How much data are you putting through your transaction log file between backups? And look at the size of your VLFs, not just the number. I'm going to switch back to my demo because it's been running for a few minutes. What you'll see now is we've been growing in that 1 gigabyte increment, and it's adding 8 VLFs at a time. I could let this run all day again and prove the same thing. Can I ask you to trust me that it's always going to do the same thing? Again, I have the scripts out there. Test this yourself. It works. So again, just for the sake of time, I could do this I could grow in 8 gigabyte increments, and it would add 16 VLFs at a time. Do I need to show that, or will you trust me on that? Okay. So what I'm going to do is, rather than let this run, I'm going to go back and create our original problem. I'm going to go back and say, I'm going to recreate my database, because I want to show the problem and then fix it. So what I'm going to do is create my database, and it's going to grow in that. It's going to use what model tells me, which I have set as the default 1 megabyte with a 10% growth. There we go. Okay, so it's now back at our default settings. And I'm going to let that run for a minute. But the other thing we want to look at is the frequency of your transaction log backups. This is a factor. So one of the things that some people don't realize is that if your transaction log file is getting big, maybe you're not backing up your log frequently enough. Now there is some overhead to it, so depending on your environment, look at how frequently you do your log backups. I've seen places where they do their transaction log backups every 5 minutes. I've seen it every hour, every 2 hours. It all depends on your business needs. Hugh, have you seen anything bigger than that? Have you seen shorter frequencies? So, okay. Again, this is where I say this is a balancing act. So what you want to look at is the amount of throughput going through your transaction log file, the size of your VLFs, and the frequency of your backups. Between those three things, you kind of want to balance the right way to manage your transaction log file. I'm seeing some stares. Is everyone with me so far? Have I lost anyone? Oh, okay. Just a word of caution. I would like to encourage you to avoid growing your transaction log files in increments larger than 8 gigabytes. If you need to grow your transaction log file, do it in 8 gigabyte increments, but not more. Because what happens is with 8 gigabyte increments, that means you're going to have 16 VLFs, which each VLF will be half a gigabyte. That's a lot of data to store in a single chunk. I wouldn't grow much bigger than this.
Another issue with the transaction log is important in that size is that instant file initialization could not participate from that means that it was standalone while it's improved.
That is true because instant file initialization does not is not supported for transaction log files. You're absolutely right. So yeah, and again, it's a balancing act, and people talk about, and I've seen some really concerning advice out there. People saying, "Oh, you shouldn't allow your database files to auto grow. That you should do it manually." I don't like that advice because at some point it may need to grow, and if I don't have hands on a keyboard to watch it, I would rather take that performance hit while the file grows. But your point's perfectly valid. Thank you. So, how do we fix a problem with our transaction log file where we've started in that 1 megabyte grow by 10%? First thing you want to look at is how big is your transaction log file today? What we're going to do is we're going to shrink it, and then we're going to put it back, but we're going to manually grow it. Now, a lot of people will say shrinking is bad. Sometimes they're right, but it depends on I wouldn't auto shrink because this is a manual shrink. I'm okay with it, but again, what I was saying, be careful not to grow more than 8 gigabytes at a time. So if you have a transaction log file that is 32 gigabytes, shrink it back down to 1 megabyte, grow it to 8 gigabytes, and then to 16, then to 24, and then to 32. Grow it manually in those 8 gigabyte chunks. So let me show you that. And that's actually what I'm going to do in my demo. All right, so what you'll see here is that I have gone back to definitely a default behavior, and I have a transaction log file that is about 1.5 gigabytes. I like nice round numbers, so what I would do in this case is I would just grow it to 2 gigabytes. Because I know the data, it's going to grow a little more. So I'm going to take that 1.5 gigabytes and grow it to 2. So let me create a virtual maintenance window. I'm going to take my database and just stop doing most of my heavy inserting right now. And what I'm going to do I can see that I have a whole lot of VLFs going on out here, but the status of 2, again, 2 means it has data in it, but it has not been backed up yet. 0 means it's ready. So what I want to do is just, before I do anything, I'm going to checkpoint this thing. I'm going to do a checkpoint and tell SQL Server to flush that data to disk. And while it does that, I'm going to do a backup log. Wow, that checkpoint's taking a while. Make sure I committed my transaction log, or committed aha, that's why. Committed my transaction. Now my checkpoint will finish. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is back up my transaction log. Now I have about 1.5 gigabytes of transactions to back up, so this is going to take a moment. So while this is running, do I have any questions? Let me try that again. Do I have any questions? All right, so while this backup finishes, let me show you the next thing I'm going to do. I'm going to do a DBCC shrink file. And that is the file I want to shrink. While that's running, let me just take that disk and see what it's doing. Wow. So this is actually a good point, is that, is everyone familiar with instant file initialization? So, and I don't know that I've enabled it on this machine, which makes sense. There it goes. So instant file initialization won't help with your transaction log file, but it will help with your transaction log file backups, because the transaction log file backups can use IFI. So all right, so what I can see here is I backed up about 134,000 pages. That's nearly 2 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink my file. All right, so now I'm down to 128 pages. Let me just validate that to make sure. 128 pages is 1 megabyte. Oh, I'm down to a gig. You know what? Every once in a while, let me do a checkpoint again. Back it up again. If there were still transactions in flight. There we go. Now this should bring it down. There we go. Now my used pages are down to 128 pages. That's 1 megabyte. So what I'm going to do, and forgive me, I'm going to do this through the GUI. I'm going to take my database, I'm going to look at my database properties and go to my files, my data files, and see how my transaction log file is 1 megabyte now. I'm going to set this at 2 gigabytes. But while I'm in here, let's fix the original source of the problem. Let me change my auto growth settings. I'm going to now grow in, say, 2 gigabyte increments. Now, this database may not get very big, so I may not need that 8 gigabyte growth. And in this case, 2 gigabytes is probably sufficient. And let it go. And then I will save this. And this will take a moment to grow. Yeah, I really wish Microsoft would enable instant file initialization for transaction logs. It would make this process go a lot faster.
Yeah, but this is not possible, not feasible because of the rotation.
Yeah, I know. But I can still wish for it. It may not be possible, but we can still wish for it. All right, so my file has grown. So what I'm going to do is look at the size of my transaction log file. And again, I can see now it is 2 gigabytes. And if I look at it, what you'll see is that I have it's 2 gigabytes, and I have only, so again, those are those first 4 VLFs that were created when the database was initialized. And then I have those, is that 8 or 16? That's 16.
16.
I only grew it in a 2 gigabyte increment. That doesn't make sense. Oh, no, that does make sense. Because anything larger than 1 gigabyte, it adds 16 VLFs. We're good. Whew. Okay. For a minute there, I thought I had a problem. So yeah, we've added 16 VLFs to this transaction log file. What does anybody think? Is this making sense? Is this helpful? Are you going to go back to your office on Monday and start looking at databases and look at your transaction log files? All right, well, you have just wasted a perfectly good hour listening to me talk about the transaction log file. So I want to thank you very much. Let me give you, please make sure you go to the website, or you can use this QR code, I'll leave it up here, and fill out the session evaluation. As I've said before, the session evaluation is very important to speakers because it tells us how we've done as in educating you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.